that doesn't explain the 840 and the evening. I don't know.
Oh,
I'm still a little lost. But it was big.
That's what the next door blog was saying.
Well, I did that. That's what I was- I couldn't figure out anything else.
do you want me to,
Just test it.
let me turn this on. Testing, testing. Kendall, can you hear me? Perfect. We're getting all sorts of fancy these days.
Sorry.
2:56. I sure am. 11 o'clock. I'm looking forward to it. Conference room. I will be there without bells. How's everyone feeling today? I'm glad to see there are other people that are excited to look at spreadsheets for the next hour.
I had nothing else to do this afternoon.
Perfect.
And it was a nice walk to the building also.
Nice.
I got it.
Well, we'll get started in a few minutes. How's the temperature in here? Is it warm? I'm always warm in here. Everyone feels okay? All right.
You're on the hot seat, that's why.
You think?
Yeah. You're right about that.
So when your spreadsheet's gonna be as exciting as Andy McDonald's.
Probably not. No. Was that what the meeting was all about this morning? What's that?
If I doze off.
Oh, if I doze off, please forgive me. I might put myself to sleep.
So do we have just a bit more life?
Yeah, we can probably adjust the lights a little bit. It's always tough to find the perfect balance between enough light and not so much that it blurs out the screen. But we'll try to adjust a little bit.
That's good.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, over there.
Right here.
Also a trick from when I used to work in restaurants, you know, you dim the lights to set the mood, but you also dim the lights because when the lights are dim, the carpet looks cleaner and the food looks better. So if we dim the lights a little bit, maybe the numbers look better. I don't know if the same thing works. Yeah. Mr. Barish, welcome. Wheatons, welcome. We got 30 seconds left before we get started. Anyone have any good jokes? Nothing, huh?
No Vincent.
What's that?
There's no Vincent.
No Vincent. Or Victor, yeah, no Victor. Yeah, Victor would be much more entertaining. But here we are. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. It is 3 o'clock, and would like to welcome those that are joining us here with masks on and distanced from each other in the GRA. It's good to be here in the GRA. I think this is the first time that I've given a formal presentation here in the GRA for quite some time. For those of you that are joining through Zoom, welcome. We are glad that you're here. Kendall, how many people do we have in the Zoom? Are there any? 4, okay. Well, welcome to the 4 of you. And welcome to anyone that may be joining us through your television on channel 998 in your homes. Hopefully the next hour will be interactive, and it won't just be me blabbing on with a bunch of numbers, but feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the course of the presentation. Kendall is going to be monitoring the chat on Zoom. So those of you that are joining us through Zoom, feel free to put questions in through the chat, and we will try to get to all of the questions that we can throughout the course of the presentation. And we may hold some of the answers to a later part of the presentation. And also, if we can't get to all of the questions, or if I don't have the answers to any of your questions, we can put together a document that we can share after the fact to provide any additional information. Hopefully answer most of your questions, but there may certainly be things that come up that we'll have to dig a little deeper for to get an answer. The goal of today's presentation is to provide an overview of where we're at so far this year. We're going to be looking primarily at operations, finances from January through June. Towards the end of the presentation, if there's time, I just got actually this morning a little bit of information for the month of July. So some of the slides right at the end I tacked on that have some information that includes July, but most of what we'll go over is January through June. We're going to look at some of the key performance indicators. We're going to compare those to where we're at this time of the year last year. And then we'll also discuss some of the impacts of COVID-19 operationally on the community. Before we get into it, I want to just acknowledge the fact that I know that this year and a half has been a heck of a doozy. It has been more challenging than I think we could have all ever imagined in so many different ways. I was having a conversation with another member of the leadership team and a resident yesterday, and still remember the day when we made the initial decision to shut down the dining rooms and go into sort of lockdown mode. And thinking, we were talking yesterday about, we were having conversations at that point saying, I wonder if this is going to be a week, maybe it'll be a month. I mean, it might be a couple of months, but we'll get through this. And here we are a year and a half later, with chairs separated from each other, all still wearing masks. countless challenges that we've all experienced over the past year and a half. Yet here we are. And I think I've been incredibly impressed on a daily basis with how resilient our community is, our team members that continue to show up day in and day out, residents that continue to be supportive through all of the craziness, and family members as well that have just been incredibly supportive. And I want to just publicly express my appreciation for all of you that are joining us in various locations, as well as our team members. I was having a conversation with a few of you earlier about sort of the impacts of COVID-19. And I think there's the direct impacts that we think about, but there's also the indirect impacts that oftentimes maybe we don't recognize. Most of you probably know, I have an 18-month-old son, and these past couple of weeks, he was sick for a little while, not with COVID, but because he was sick, he couldn't go to daycare. Because he couldn't go to daycare, he had to stay home. We have a babysitter, and we don't want to just send him to any random place for daycare or have random babysitters come in. So we have one babysitter that we know has been vaccinated, and she's gracious enough to be tested on a regular basis. But she got sick last week, and trying to balance family life and Amy, my wife, working from home and trying to juggle all of the different responsibilities. I just think of all of our hardworking team members and how they manage to juggle all of the responsibilities that are so much more complicated these days than they've ever been. And anyways, it's this year and a half has presented so many challenges in many ways. Some of those will be reflected in some of the numbers that we look at today. And some are not necessarily have a financial impact, but in any event, here we go. Let's dive right in. So operating margin, we'll get right to it. Year to date, for the first 6 months of the year, the Terraces of Los Gatos is just shy of $600,000 below budgeted operating margin. So our target budget for operating margin, we're $600,000 behind that target. And we're going to dig into it. Okay, so here we go. These are all, again, total numbers from January through June of this year, 2021. So operating revenue, we'll start with. Our actual operating revenue for the entire community is 14 million, almost 15 million operating revenue. Our budget is also almost 15 million. So we're actually slightly ahead of budget for our operating margin by $17,000. So that's good. Typically, however, the Terraces of Los Gatos, we have a rich history of far surpassing our budgeted operating revenue numbers. And what that does, and has historically done over the years, is provide us with a nice cushion where we can maybe staff a little more or be a little less frugal, if you will, with some of our expenses because we have that, typically have a sizable cushion in our operating revenue. This year, we don't really have that cushion that we've enjoyed over the years. Total employee cost is 7.4 million year to date, and our budget is 7.2 million. So we're just about $200,000 over budget for total employee costs. That includes salaries, that includes benefits, direct benefits, indirect benefits, when we have team member activities and parties, that type of thing typically falls under total employee costs. It also includes medical, dental, 401k plans, and things of that nature. Non-wage expenses, our actual expense year to date, 5.5 million. Our budget is just about 5 million. So we are, as you can see here, about $400,000 over budget for our non-wage expenses. And a little later in the presentation, we'll drill down on some of these in greater detail to outline or itemize some of the items that are included in these categories. Overall operating expense, so we're about $600,000 over our total operating expense, which leaves us, therefore, about $600,000 behind our target operating margin for the year. Any questions on this very high-level summary before we move on to the next slide? Okay. We're going to show a lot of graphs because I figured graphs are a little more enjoyable to look at than straight numbers. So I'll go through, I've got a series of slides and I'll go through each one. I like to see how things are trending month over month. So on this first graph, there are 4 things. It shows operating revenue, operating expense for 2021, and also operating revenue and operating expense for 2020, so we can see how we compare to last year. This first, we'll just go from the top down. This line here is operating revenue for 2020, so last year's operating revenue. As you can see at the beginning of the year, started off fairly strong, and as we got into March, April, May, and June, once COVID started impacting the community, we saw a steady decline in operating revenue. In the next, right here, this sort of dark blue line, this is operating revenue for 2021. So nice trajectory. So instead of going down for the first 6 months, trending down at least for the 6 months, first 6 months as we did in 2020, we're trending as of February at least, trending up, which is fantastic, and we'll look at what caused that a little bit later. These last 2 lines are our expenses. So the yellow one is operating expenses from 2020, and this gray one is operating expenses from 2021. Margin. So margin, as we all know, is your total revenue less your total expenses. So what you're left with at the end of the day. Oops, let's see here. So the orange line is 2020, operating margin for 2020, first 6 months of the year, and the blue line is 2021. So again, as we saw in the revenue for 2021, we're trending upwards, overall trending upwards for the first 6 months of the year for operating margin 2021. Now we're going to drill down to some of the more specific, and then we'll get even more specific shortly. Total employee costs. So this is comparison, again, 2020 to 2021. The orange is 2020, and the blue is 2021. So we overall operating costs for total employee costs slightly below this year as we were last year, at least for the first few months of the year. And as last year, employee costs went down. If you can recall, we made some fairly drastic changes to some of our staffing patterns. Although we didn't lose any team members or we didn't have to terminate any positions, we scaled back some of the hours of some of our positions to compensate for some of the revenue loss. And this year, we haven't necessarily done that in the same way. And so our operating employee costs have, at least for the last 4 months, remained fairly stable as occupancy has picked up in primarily in health center.
Brother,
Yes.
to what extent is difference between this year and last in terms of employee costs due to increased wage and benefits?
Okay, so great question, Linda, and I'll repeat it just so everyone can hear it. The question, and I'll paraphrase it, is the difference in employee costs of this year to last year. To what extent is it differences in wages? Is that right? Wages and benefits. So I think actually there may be a slide that shows that a little bit more in detail. So let's hold off on that actually. If we don't get there, remind me again. Okay. But I think we have a slide that speaks to that a little bit later. Full-time equivalents. So this actually may speak to this a little bit. Full-time equivalents, just to explain what that means, it's not necessarily team members. It's not the number of staff members that we have, but it's the number of full-time staff members that we are operating with. So let's see. I'll explain it in practical terms. If we have one person that works 40 hours a week, that is one full-time equivalent. If we have two people that work 20 hours a week, that works out to be also one full-time equivalent. If we have one team member that works 80 hours a week, that's two full-time equivalents. So it's the total number of hours, essentially the total number of hours that are worked under the assumption that every team member works a full schedule, 40 hours a week. Total hours divided by 40. Much more easily articulated. Thank you. So in 2020, we started off the year at about 228 full-time equivalents. We saw a reduction trending down over the first 6 months of the year. Until June, we were down to about 194. And then in the subsequent months, we went down a little tiny bit more, but not much. And that was due to a number of reasons. We reduced, we made our standard shifts. We moved from a standard 8-hour shift to a 7.5-hour shift for most positions. And then we made some reductions in hours in some positions that weren't necessarily needed. Our budgeted full-time equivalent, so our budgeted staffing levels, is actually right about here. It's about 212. And so that sort of puts things into perspective. Wonder if we shut one of these lights off in the front. I'm gonna see if that will help, Kendall. Zoom, is that better? Any word, Kendall? All right.
I think they're wanting the screen to be shared.
Yeah,
That's possible.
no, it's not, unfortunately. But what we can do is make sure that we make these slides available after the fact to review. Sorry for those that are on Zoom that may not be able to see these well. All right, cost per labor hour. So this is, we take all of our labor expenses, all of our salaries, all of our employee costs, and divide that by the full-time equivalents, or divide that, excuse me, by the total number of hours worked. So every hour that a team member works, this is the expense to the community. So as you can see here, this is last year, 2020, first 6 months of the year, floating right around between 29, 21, 950. And then this year, a fairly decent increase. So between 30 to 75 an hour. That reflects roughly a 3.5% increase in total employee cost. So I don't know if that answers your question, Linda, but so benefits, cost per hour for benefits, there was a slight increase, negligible. Our community support center worked really hard to keep benefit costs down this year after last year. So the vast majority of the increase is simply due to wages. We budgeted overall a 3.5% increase for our team members. We actually, most of our team members, or many of our team members, we were able to go a little higher than that for annual increases. For our exempt team members, our salaried, mostly our leadership team members, we went without an increase this year so that we could allocate more of that labor increase percentage to our hourly team members. Non-wage expenses. So this is everything else that is not a team member expense. So these are supplies, and we'll actually get into some of the specific items that are included in this, but mostly supplies, food, medical supplies, contract services that we have, paper, office supplies, soap, detergent. What's that? PPE is included in here. Basically anything else that's not something that's being paid to a team member is here. We see here our non-wage expenses. We saw a fairly significant decrease over the first few months. And then in May to June, it went up. And I can tell you the next 6 months, it kept going up because of PPE, because of COVID testing is also included in here, and some of the other expenses related to COVID. Blue line obviously is 2020. We had a little bit of an increase in February and March, or March and April, excuse me. Went back down in May. Things started settling down. Some of the testing requirements loosened up, so we weren't as aggressively testing all of our team members or residents. And then we went back up in June, and July we had to go back a little bit more as well. There we go. Yes, Mr. Barish. Yes, expense per month. So our peak here in April, roughly $1 million in non-wage expenses. In May of last year, about 700,000. So these are fairly sizable dollars we're talking about. Okay, we're gonna not dwell on this too much. We're gonna go through the different levels of living and look at occupancy and revenue on a monthly basis. Again, comparing 2020 to 2021. This first looking at residential living, occupancy 2021 compared to 2020, slightly below where we were, following a similar pattern. Traditionally, at the end of the year, we finish the year full or very close to being full. First few months of the year, traditionally, not a whole lot of move-ins to the community. And so there's usually a little bit of a dip in the first few months. And then typically it picks back up. Although these last 2 years have not necessarily seen the same pick up. Some of the things that to keep in mind of why this is the case. Obviously, we're slightly below where we were last year, and last year we were slightly below where we would have liked to have been. Last year, we weren't doing construction for a good, at least after the first couple months of the year. And so we couldn't renovate the apartments. This year, fortunately, we are able to renovate the apartments, although it's much more challenging than it was. The permitting process takes much longer than it traditionally has. There are a lot of supply chain challenges that we've experienced and we continue to experience, and we anticipate we will continue to experience for several months, if not years. We may get into a little bit further, but things like appliances, really hard to get these days. We had a strategy meeting this morning, and we got to the point where we're going to be working with our construction teams and our buildings and grounds teams, and basically going to every appliance store that we can find. And if you can find a stove or you can find a refrigerator that'll work, just buy it, and we'll buy it retail so that we can get them. There's challenges that are there. The nice thing is still there. And so even though our occupancy levels are slightly below where we would like them to be, it's not for lack of demand, but really lack of available supply, because we can't move residents in as quickly as we'd like. Phil.
It takes quite a while to turn over. And if you could turn them over faster, could you fill them faster?
We will fill them as soon as we can turn them over.
So if we figured out a way to get turnaround time faster, it would help.
Absolutely. Yep. Good point. Okay, so looking over on the right-hand side, this is revenue. So it follows obviously the same trends, although 2021's revenue is higher due to a couple of factors, rate increases, obviously year after year, and then actually the breakdown of what apartments happen to be available during that time also impacts it. So if we have several patio homes available, which we did actually at the beginning of last year, that's going to make more of an impact than if you have alcove apartments that are available, because when those are vacant, there's less of a financial hit to the community. Assisted living, it's kind of all over the place, to be perfectly honest. And so we won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but you can see how we compare last year to this year for the first 6 months, occupancy in assisted living, and then corresponding revenue per month in assisted living. Memory care. Last year, we had our lowest occupancy numbers in memory care for quite some time. We got down to, actually, we got all the way down to 12 out of 16, which is really unheard of. I don't know if that's ever happened in the history of our Grove. And it was primarily because we weren't moving any residents in to the Grove during that time. This year, year to date, we started off with 14 out of 16 occupied, and we've been sitting at 15 for most of the year. I think the last apartment has been filled, and so I think we're now up to 100%, 16 out of 16. And corresponding revenue for memory care. Skilled nursing. This is a big lever. This one, occupancy in skilled nursing has a huge financial impact on the operations of the community. Last year, we started the year off at 52, I think, occupied beds out of 59 total available in the health center. We saw a decline and then an even further decline in the subsequent months last year in skilled nursing. And again, primarily because we weren't admitting patients into the health center. We were on occasion under certain circumstances, but we made a conscious decision that we wanted to do all that we could to protect our community and significantly restrict the admissions that we brought into the health center. Did that have a huge financial impact on the community? Yes. Was it still the right thing to do? Absolutely. We can see the financial impact last year that had. We went from almost $1.2 million in revenue in the month of January, all the way down to a little under $700,000 per month. So that's a $500,000 spread reduction in operating revenue per month, which obviously is very significant. Fortunately, when there is we're able to manage Oh, that was a phone alarm. Okay. I was like, oh no, not a fire alarm right now. Now I totally lost my train of thought. Oh, we're able to manage the operating expenses fairly significantly in the health center. And so when we have a huge reduction in occupancy in the health center, the team is very good at adjusting fairly quickly to be able to reduce expenses. As we can see this year, a little bit of a different trend, a very positive trend. We got all the way down below 30 in the month of February, but after that, as things were starting to look really good and COVID numbers were down further lower than we had seen in a year, and we hadn't seen any cases here at the community. Admissions went up. Hospitals started having more elective surgeries. We felt more confident admitting more patients into the health center. And so our occupancy numbers for the first 6 months, or at least the
Gaslight the Park and West Street.
Okay.
How far off in terms of numbers of people in the health center are we?
Good question. So our current budget We made some adjustments this year to our budget expectations in the health center. Traditionally, we've had a budget of 53 out of 59, give or take one or so. We adjusted our budget expectation this year down to 48. So we're budgeted to have 48 occupied beds in the health center. So obviously February significantly below that. In April though, we were just shy of our budget for occupancy in the health center. May we dipped a little, and then by June was the first time we had hit our budget for occupancy in the health center for quite some time, which was great. Because as you can see here, very obviously strong positive correlation between occupancy and revenue. So in the month of June this year, about 1.2 million compared to $700,000. So that's $500,000 difference from last year to this year. Fortunately, this presentation only covers the first 6 months of the year. Because the last month, July, unfortunately, we weren't able to maintain this trend. Actually, July we wasn't so bad. August has been really rough, but we'll get into that in a presentation 6 months from now. Here's something that is unique from last year to this year. Last year, we received a total throughout the year of $850,000 in relief funds from the federal government. By this time last year, we had allocated $472,000 of that to our operating revenue. I just averaged that out month over month. We didn't actually do it that way, but just for the sake of this slide, it made more sense to just average it out. So the orange line is the monthly operating revenue for 2020. The gray line is operating revenue less those relief funds. So if we hadn't gotten those relief funds, this would have been our actual operating revenue for 2020, first 6 months of the year. This year, overall operating revenue is trending in the right direction, different direction than last year, which is great. This blue number of this year doesn't include any relief funds. So we haven't received any, and we don't anticipate, there's nothing scheduled, no relief funding that's at least that I'm aware of that we're scheduled to receive this year. That being said, the way things are starting to look right now, who knows what may happen between now and the end of the year. So if we look at the difference between what we would have been at without those relief funds to where we are now, obviously it's a greater difference, greater variance. COVID supplies. Last year, January, February, smooth sailing. We didn't even have a GL account for COVID supplies. Right? We had our regular supplies and we had our regular inventory of PPE and emergency PPE supplies that we have on hand, but it's not something that we significantly had to spend money on a monthly basis. Obviously, once April hit, we started, once March hit, started purchasing lots of PPE. Those invoices started coming in. April, obviously, we went up quite a bit, about $50,000. And that is roughly where we were at for most of the year, about $50,000 a month on COVID-related supplies. So that includes face masks, N95 respirators, gowns, additional gloves beyond what our typical inventory would be, face shields, goggles, all of that stuff, as well as, nope, just that. I think that's everything. I don't think we've coded. The only thing I'm not sure of is dining, food, to-go supplies. Some of that may have gone into the COVID account, but I'm not totally sure on that. Okay, so that was last year. This year, not only did we need to continue to purchase all of those supplies, everyone else on the planet had to also purchase those supplies. Supply went down, costs went up, and we weren't necessarily purchasing any more supplies here than we were at least here, but costs have just gone astronomical. For example, gloves, the gloves that we typically use, the prices have fluctuated quite a bit over the last year, but they got up to almost double what we typically spend on gloves. It's tapered off a little bit, but not much. And we had to start looking at all sorts of alternative vendors that we typically purchase our supplies from, because we had to go wherever we could get them. We have a really strong procurement department with Human Good, and they were always able to help us remain stocked with everything that we needed. We just had to, obviously pay for it. Phil.
Is that department located in like Pleasanton or?
Yeah, our director of procurement, I think is what her official title is. She works out of the Glendale office.
Glendale, okay.
And she maintains all the relationships at a corporate level with all of the different vendors.
Your requisitions go to Glendale.
Say it one more time.
Your requisitions for materials go to Glendale.
Yes and no. For most of the past year, when PPE was very scarce, essentially everything was coming through Glendale. When our director of procurement for all of our communities calls a vendor and says, I want to buy 1 million N95 masks, she has a little bit more leverage than us calling our supplier and saying, hey, we need 1,000. And so that really helped. We relied heavily on them, but also at a local level, Mark Rivera was managing our PPE inventory here, and he had, I don't know where he made some of the contacts that he did, but we were actually able to get some additional supplies locally beyond what we were able to get through Glendale. Glendale still maintains a very sizable emergency stock of emergency supplies. Vendors now at this point. At some point that may have to change again, but we hope not. Seen a steady decline over the past several months as COVID numbers decreased. This unfortunately now is going up a little bit, and hopefully it doesn't go up we don't have to send it up too much further, but we're starting to anticipate a greater need of PPE potentially.
Are the costs for the vaccines included in that slide?
Good question. Was the cost of the vaccines included in that particular slide?
Particularly the people involved.
And no, the vaccine fortunately has no financial cost. So all the vaccines, regardless of where they come from or who provides them, Yes, but we don't pay them. It all gets paid for through the, at least until now, it's all been paid for through the government. So there's no cost for the vaccinations. Testing, on the other hand, different story. And actually, testing is not included in this, but it is included actually in here. Not going to go through all of these, but this breaks down all of the different line items for the non-wage expenses, comparing 2021 to previous year, and then variance. So this year for non-wage expenses, about $640,000, spending more this year compared to last year. Bad debt, good question. So this right here, bad debt, this year we've had an expense of $146,000. Last year, 73,000 for a variance of 74,000. Bad debt is billed revenue that we are unable to collect. And it is primarily health center revenue that insurance for one reason hasn't paid yet, and hopefully does eventually pay. But any revenue that's sitting on the books for 180 days that hasn't been paid, we essentially write that debt as a bad debt expense. We still continue to try to collect that revenue, but we've wiped it off of the books after 180 days. So
There are a couple items over 200,000 up there. Could you elaborate on those?
I sure can. So
ALMCSN.
So this first one is the most significant one. And this is non-wage expenses, but to be honest, it's a little bit deceptive because it sort of is wages. Or it encompasses some wages. Direct resident care, 1.4 million this year, 1.2 million roughly last year. That is ALMC and SN, stands for assisted living, memory care, and skilled nursing. Very little of it is for assisted living or memory care. Most of it is skilled nursing, and it is the cost for therapy. So all of our therapists, and this is where it actually kind of is wages, but not officially wages. All of our therapists are not actually human good team members, but they're team members of a company that we've partnered with called O&R. So all of their wages go under that direct resident care line item. Also, routine lab services for residents and patients in the health center, medications for residents and patients in the health center, at least for those that we cover the cost of the medications for, and those other services. That all falls under that category.
Some of it's offset by insurance payments.
Indirectly. So if somebody comes into the health center and say they're there for 2 weeks after they've had surgery on their knee, and they're there for 2 weeks of rehabilitation services, Medicare or the other insurance companies, but most are covered by Medicare. Medicare will pay the Terraces of Los Gatos, will say $900 a day for them to stay in the health center. But the caveat is the community or the pays for all of the expenses to care for that individual. So whether the expenses, so that includes all their medications, all their rehab services, all of their supplies, the community pays for those directly. And then hopefully the goal is that all of those expenses are less than that $900 a day that we receive from Medicare. And so that's why there is a fairly strong correlation between the expenses and the revenue in the health center, because if there are 10 fewer patients in the health center, we're not paying for the therapy services, we're not paying for the medications, we're not paying for all of those ancillary expenses that fall under that direct resident care line item. Mr. Barrett, did you have a question? So the question is, what is the distinction between group management fees and operating margin? So group management fees is a set amount, it's a percentage of budgeted. I don't know actually if it's a percentage of budgeted expense or budgeted revenue, but it's a set monthly fee that we essentially pay to Human Good for the services that are provided primarily from the Community Support Center. So that goes, so we pay, where are we? Roughly $1 million. And then that covers the salaries for all the people that work at the Community Support Center, all of the accounting services, all of the nursing, clinical support, resources. There's a lot of contract services that fall under there, covers essentially everything to operate the Community Support Center, community support centers. And then the distinction between that and operating margin is the operating margin isn't necessarily an expense per se. The operating margin is ultimately what goes to the bank at the end of the day. And so all of our communities pay a set group management fee, and it doesn't, as a percentage, it doesn't vary from community to community. Obviously, operating margin and how much ultimately goes into the bank does vary from community to community.
Debt service, or it shows up in the budget someplace.
Sorry, say it one more time.
Debt service.
Debt service.
Yeah, because Human Goods got.
Oh, yes. So that actually, that's a good question, because that is one of the expenses that operating margin is used to cover, but it is not considered an operating expense. And so it actually won't show up here. But like interest expenses, that is sort of separate from operating expenses. And I don't have the specific numbers in this presentation. I want to say it's $117,000 a month, but I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong, but for some reason, that's the number that comes to mind. Full-time equivalent breakdown. We looked at the slides, the graph earlier, but this just breaks it down by department. Not a huge variance from last year to this year. For our departments, overall, we are about 2.5 full-time equivalents below where we were last year this time of year. Challenges from COVID-19. I'm going to just go through these real quickly. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, supply chain challenges. There's the actual supplies themselves. There's a huge scarcity on so many supplies that are needed. It's getting worse in many respects right now as schools are opening, as restaurants and all businesses across the entire world are opening, who have not been purchasing many of the supplies that we rely heavily on are now purchasing those supplies. And so we're starting to see more and more scarcity on everything from chicken to paper bags to, I don't know, trash bags, everything. Also, they're all experiencing their logistical staffing challenges as well. Delivery drivers are causing, we've had some communities that their food deliveries just aren't coming because they don't have drivers to deliver the foods. Other challenges, we mentioned earlier, PPE, testing and supplies, occupancy challenges, primarily in the health center, but all of the areas are impacted. Residential living, as we talked about, primarily due to construction and supply chain challenges. Staffing and labor, I think there's the sort of simplistic challenges that we're experiencing that every industry is facing right now. But there's also just the logistics of everything. As I was mentioning earlier, my son, he was sick and so he couldn't go to daycare. And so that creates a challenge. For every team member that has a sick child, they have to figure out, how do I get to work today? Just showing up to work, even when the team members are fully committed and dedicated, it's much more challenging than it's ever been before. And also just overall morale. It's challenging, and some people just need some time away, and we want to grant that as much as we possibly can because it's so important, but it creates challenges. Ms. Roth.
In the meeting today, time and time again, they said that labor costs have risen unprecedented. It just, they've never seen anything like it. That we're lucky that a lot of people stay here to work because they love the community and the residents. But a lot of them know that they can just walk across the street sometimes and get a lot more per hour.
Yeah, for those of you who may not have been able to hear, Mrs. Roth essentially just said that she was in a meeting this morning with Human Good, and just talking about the unprecedented labor challenges that we're facing, and how now more than ever, wages are going up, which is ultimately a good thing, but it creates a lot of challenges. And actually, I want to just show, I'll skip over some of this stuff for the sake of time, but I want to show these two slides because it relates to what you just said. This first one here is number of, or percentage of open positions. So of our total number of positions that we have here at the terraces, 10.5% of those positions are not filled. They're open. They're being filled by people working overtime, by outside agency workers when need be, or by other team members, picking up additional responsibilities to cover the workload. Here is our turnover. Historically, the terraces has very, very low turnover numbers. We like to tout that it's the lowest in the organization, and our organization is one of the best in the industry with our turnover numbers. That being said, it's still a challenge. It's still really, really difficult. And we're starting to see this number creep up a little bit. And in all likelihood, we'll probably continue to see it creep up a little bit more. And there's so many factors involved in that. I've been in countless meetings about this topic. I was in one yesterday, and we were talking about how important it is to have the right company culture, creating an environment where people enjoy coming to work and they love what they do. But also in today's climate, the almighty dollar is more important than it's ever been. And for that team member who's struggling to put food on their table, struggling to pay rent at the end of the month, as much as they may love working at the terraces of Los Gatos or wherever it is they work, if they can make $1 more somewhere else, that speaks louder than anything else these days. And so it's something that we have to constantly keep our finger on the pulse of that, and constantly seeing where we can make adjustments and what we need to do to retain the best talent and also aggressively recruit new talent. Yes.
I was just wondering how you maintain team members' morale, because my every connection with the team members, they've always been very, very pleasant, even under trying circumstances. They were very, very pleasant and treated me with great courtesy. Do that.
I don't, you do that, to be totally honest. It's all of you that are the most significant motivators for our team members. Our team members continue to show up day in and day out because they love you and you love them, and not necessarily anything that I'm doing.
My understanding was that you said that you reduced the work shift for a non-exempt from 8 to 7.5.
Yes.
This was a salary cut for them.
Yes.
Are we going back to the 8 hours now?
We are, in some positions, we've gone back up to 8 hours. In some positions, we've gone back up to 7.75. We're sort of working on how to best balance that out at the moment. So there have been some adjustments to bring those hours back up. Yes, Phil.
In that question that you answered, Patty, I think it's appropriate to bring up that we just got a letter today for the Team Appreciation Fund. If you want to help, that'd be a good way to do it.
Thank you, Phil. For those of you that may not have heard, in terms of team member satisfaction and retention and morale, I guess the letters for the Team Member Appreciation Fund just went out today. And so if you are in a position to be able to contribute to the Team Member Appreciation Fund, that is a huge benefit for our team members that they definitely appreciate. We're after 4 o'clock right now, and I know we're scheduled to go from 3 to 4, but I'm happy to continue. I won't present anything else, but I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions. But if you'd like to leave, or if you have other obligations, I will not be offended if you walk out. If you throw a chair or swear on your way out, I may be slightly offended, but probably not much. Linda.
Compared to the other communities in Human, where do we stand in comparison to that? Given all the jobs?
Good question. So the question is, where do we stand in comparison to other human good communities? In what way? I'm assuming financially? Financially. So if we're looking at variance to budget, we are not doing fantastic. Some communities are meeting or exceeding their operating margin budget expectations. Some communities are not, the Terraces of Los Gatos being one of them. That being said, if you look at actual operating margin, we are right up at the top of the organization. So we're sort of constantly neck and neck with one or two other communities. So we're still overall, we're financially strong as a community if we're looking just at operating margin and not comparing it to budget expectations. But our budget expectations here at the Terraces of Los Gatos are significantly higher than some of the other communities because historically we've met those margins. Mr. Barish.
Bradley, the morale and the stress on the employees, do you track how many or what percentage of the employees have second jobs? It's an indicator of the stress. And it's insightful if you know that information.
That's a good question. So the question was in terms of team member morale, do we track number of team members that have second jobs? And we don't, but there could definitely be value in that. Anecdotally, I would say that of our team members, I would say at least 50% of them have a second, if not a third job, which definitely makes an impact.
Two things.
Yes.
I don't know how we can make business to ask them how many were working this other job. The other thing is, if I look at the numbers, the income exceeds the outgo, so there is a positive margin even with
Yes.
the interest burden. So we may not have hit budget, but we're still.
Yeah,
Positive.
what's going on? Yeah, so actually just going back all the way to the first or second slide, if we look at, this is our operating margin. So I don't have budget on here, but our operating margin is, for the month of June at least, was slightly under $500,000 operating margin, which is a strong operating margin, budgeted month after month. It's not quite where we're at in terms of budget, but still a strong performance. Linda.
We haven't talked about, operate, not operating, but the other way. For the.
Capital
air
budgets.
conditioning, for the elevators.
Yes.
So where are we in terms of that budget?
That's a great question. I can share some information about that in writing later. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. Yeah, so what we looked at today doesn't include entry fees and capital budgets. So entrance fees, which typically fund the capital budgets. But I can share some information about that at a later date. Any other questions? Anything in the chat, Kendall? Okay. We'll make these slides available on TLG Connect within the next 3 or 4 days. And if you have any other questions that you think of or that you were hesitant to ask, feel free to reach out to me and we'll get them answered for you. Thank you all for joining. Linda. Yes, we will have copies printed and available at the concierge desk upon request. And if we need to print more, then we can print more. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day. I think everyone was clapping because they could leave.